All right, welcome back to the Prolific Author Podcast. We are here today with Adam Richardson, and I'm very excited to have Adam on the podcast because I have actually listened to his podcast for quite some time. He is not only a crime writer, but he is a former detective, and he does a great service to, crime and mystery authors because he is able to tell us what is reality when it comes to kind of the logistics of the law and sort of the criminal side of things. So how are you doing today, Adam?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us, who you are and what you write and what you do.
So my name is Adam Richardson, and I'm host of the Writers Detective Bureau podcast. And I got into this back in 2015 as a blogger, really, of being able to help crime fiction writers with kind of the cop stuff. Right. And then that turned into a podcast, and now I teach online courses and all that other kind of stuff. And I do have a nonfiction book in the works. It's been in the works for a couple of years now, but I really need, like most of your listeners probably, need to put more time in the writing seat rather than listening to podcasts and doing all the other fun stuff that we call research, but it's really procrastinating.
Right. It really is. It really is. So what made you decide to start helping, other authors with this side of things?
I blame it on the wine. No, so I was, I'm in Southern California. And so some friends of ours, so my wife and I have some friends that are in the entertainment industry. And so we did this wine tasting trip. And while we were wine tasting, one of the guys on the trip was a screenwriter. And he asked me this question about a story he's writing that involved a police detective. I didn't really think anything of it. I was like, oh yeah, here's the answer to your question.
Right.
And then once the wine wore off the next day, I thought, aha, I bet there are a lot of other writers. At the time, it was just screenwriters, but screenwriters and authors that have questions about law enforcement and how, how cops do things, how prosecutors do things, how the whole system works. And then, so that was really what started the blog. But that led me to really learning about the craft of storytelling. The same kind of things that authors and screenwriters are doing. So it was really not just helping with the reality of stuff, but really being able to understand what writers were trying to get out of the cops that they talk to. Because, you go on a ride along or you sit through a Citizens Academy class or something, and you don't really know how to ask the question because you're trying to deal with a plot point or some progressive complication or how something's happening in a story. And so I really took it upon myself to kind of learn the dialogue that the writers are going, are trying to, not the dialogue in the story, but like what the writers are trying to accomplish when they're talking to cops for their story, doing their research, and kind of try to figure out how that works and reverse engineer that process. And so that's what's led to what I'm doing today. And I have about 18 months left in my career before I retire. And from there, I'm definitely going to be joining the fiction writing world as well. So Good. I see just how daunting a task it is to put books together. And my hat is off to everyone who even attempts it, because it is way more work than anyone knows until, as you well know, until they actually try to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And that actually forays well into kind of my next question. So, I was going to ask if you've done any crime writing yet on your own, any fiction writing, I mean.
I've done 2 treatments for story ideas that I have. One's actually a political thriller, not a crime, not exactly a criminal thing. But then I do have 2 other ideas for series that, we'll see where that leads to.
That's fun. I'm excited for you. So, as someone who you were kind of talk to us about your career, you were a detective, you were a cop for a long time. So you probably have kind of seen it all in terms of that side of things.
Yeah. When you think you've seen it all, it means you haven't. That's when you're going to get surprised and something new is going to come down the pike. But yeah, no, I've been very lucky having had a variety of investigative assignments. I was promoted to detective very early in my career, and then I got to work in some pretty special assignments. So I have had, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily like the dialed in, like Bosch kind of homicide investigator by any means, but I have been in so many different kinds of investigations in so many different roles that I have a pretty good handle on a lot of different types of investigations. So not just, I mean, I worked in a major crimes unit that included sexual assault, robbery, and homicide. So I worked a lot of those cases. Worked fraud cases, worked counterterrorism cases, narcotics cases, undercover stuff, protection details, and not a typical career path, but it's almost been perfect to set me up for being able to help writers, because if you can dream up the scenario, there's a pretty good chance that I've either worked it, or I can tell you that it is a little unrealistic. Or if it isn't something that I have done personally, I certainly know the people that do it for real in real life and can probably help with answering that question.
Yeah, that's nice. And so I kind of want to give people an idea of how it works. What kinds of questions do you often get asked by writers? What are they looking for from you?
So the podcast that I have is literally just answering questions that writers have.
Right.
So it can be anything from how would my character accomplish this to what would this fictional department look like? I mean, there's a million questions, and I do get a lot of the repeat ones. The ones that I see a lot are ones where the author, to try to keep the story interesting, has created a task force of some sort, right? Where they're pairing a local cop with either another agency of some sort. It could be a Fed, and then in the effort to try to build some sort of conflict, I guess, between the characters and stuff. And a lot of times, I mean, that does happen in real life. The majority of the cases are you show up, you get assigned a case, and you work it. And it's not necessarily a task force thing. Or when there is a task force, like the FBI is involved, it's been my experience, and this differs by agency, but it's been my experience that FBI has been nothing but supportive. They come in with all their tech. They pay for stuff as far as like, we can't afford to do X, Y, or Z in an investigation. The feds are like, hey, we've got the funding. That's no problem. We'll take care of that for you. There are some agencies out there that have kind of more animosity with the FBI. And that usually is when they're a larger agency and they have their own resources. So they feel like, we don't need your tech. We don't need your money. We don't need your help. Leave us alone.
Right.
But working for a not so big agency, they have been absolutely wonderful. And so when I see that in writing, a lot of it is, I mean, to be honest, writing criminal procedure and trying to make it realistic, if you have not been in or around that career, is very daunting, right? We already, as writers, we're worried about character, we're worried about story arc, we're worried about realistic dialogue, all these things. And now all of a sudden we add this additional set of rules on top called criminal justice, criminal procedure, criminal investigation, whatever you want to call it. It's like, how am I supposed to win if I don't know all this stuff, right? So trying to demystify that is really what my whole goal has been. And sometimes the questions are super basic, that are very easy to answer. And sometimes it is very situational where they've kind of painted themselves into this corner. And then it's kind of a way, honestly, the best way to figure out the way to create a believable story is to start with the end in mind. And I know I don't want to call them pantsers, we'll call them discovery writers. That's hard to do sometimes. But once you finish that first draft and you've figured out where your characters are leading your adventure, once you start, if you aren't starting with the end in mind, get to the end and then try to reverse engineer your way to it, kind of like working a puzzle maze. You start at the center, kind of cheating, if you will, right? And working your way back to the start. That tends to be the easiest way to create a believable through line. And I've worked with television writers' rooms and movie directors that wrote the screenplay and stuff like that. And we always start with the end and work our way back to the beginning, rather than ending up in this, well, what if this happened? Or what if this happened? It's like, let's start with how it ends, and then we can work our way back and not have to deal with all the what ifs. Right.
Yeah. And that's excellent advice. So from a practical standpoint, like if you have someone who's writing crime, would you say they need to figure out, like you said, the story, the ending and everything, and then at that point, go back and put in the logistics of the criminal investigation?
Having a basic understanding of the criminal investigation, of how they work, is key. for sure.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying you need to have spent any kind of time in law enforcement or anything, but it would be really helpful if you take an intro to administration of justice class at the local community college, or you go to a citizens academy at your local police department, or go for a ride along if you're so inclined. I know that might be outside of the adventure zone for some writers, but just kind of trying to develop contacts that you can ask questions of. Of course, that's what I'm here for as well. But
Right.
Getting that basic understanding of, okay, we start with a crime has happened and an investigation is literally, we're looking backward on our timeline and trying to piece those investigative questions together of what evidence points us to explaining what happened. And then once we know what happened and who's responsible for it, then we get a search warrant, get an arrest warrant, we make the arrest, and then we go forward with the prosecution. And understanding that whole process, I think, is really key. I mean, you could learn all that stuff in an afternoon with, Wikipedia or YouTube or something like that for sure. But
right.
just understanding that basic process will really help with knowing what your characters are going to do and what their intentions are when they're in these scenes, right? So when we have that interview and interrogation scene, and also understanding the tropes to a certain extent. One example is the interrogation scene, right? In reality, I'm trying to get admissions, I'm trying to get statements, and a lot of times this can be a several hour long thing. And if you try to make that a several hour long scene in your book, your editor's going to kill you because you're bogging down the story and all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of an accepted, I don't want to call it a trope. It is a trope, but it's kind of an accepted thing as readers. We're like, oh, when we get to the investigation scene, this is where the detective kind of lays out for the reader all the exposition of this is what you did and this is what happened. Like, we've seen it time and time and time again. That's not really what happens. But the best piece of advice I can give you is story comes first over realism. Nobody goes to the police department and buys police reports to read them for fun. Right. So they go to the bookstore or they go to the library. So you have to keep that story moving. You have to keep it interesting. And if it is at the expense of some realism, that's totally fine. You just can't, the genre itself doesn't allow for it to suspend too much disbelief. It's one thing if it's a fantasy, but when you're along for a realism ride, you can't just have it completely depart from reality where everyone's like, the bad guy would have been arrested at this point. You can't just let him go, or you can't just ignore it, So understanding those basic things, I think, is key.
And that really feeds into the next question I was going to ask is that, why is it important to get these, at least some of the details right? But I mean, you kind of answered it, that this audience expects a certain amount of realism. Are there other reasons you can think of to also?
To keep your review stars up on Amazon and to not have an inbox full of angry readers. The other one that, especially if you're going for the realism thing, just doing your if you write about American law enforcement where any kind of gun is involved, just do the very basic research. I'm not a big gun guy, but just knowing basic things like, the revolver safety, there's no safety on a revolver or on a Glock, or on a Glock, there's no hammer. So little things like that, where anybody who's writing a story that's never used the gun before isn't going to know that. And it's not, honestly, it's not a big deal. It's almost like a typo in a book. But if you're a gun person, you're like, oh, this person doesn't, all of a sudden they put down the book and it's like, I don't know why it's such a big foul for a lot of readers. But the firearms stuff is, you can be as generic as you want to be. But as soon as you start adding detail that isn't correct, then a lot of readers get upset. So just doing your homework, double checking, or having somebody, if you know somebody that knows something about firearms or whatever, not to turn this into a promo, but I do have a little course on it as well. But you can certainly avoid the backlash from your readers just by doing a little bit of homework. And the other thing, though, that can be fun but a little frustrating is that as you do a ton of research, there's this inclination to want to include that research in your book to explain things, and then your editor's like, nope, you get rid of this, it's slowing down the pace, and you just kind of have to, it's like, okay, I did this so I feel good about the fact that I know I'm not wrong, even if it doesn't actually make it into the manuscript.
Yeah. And that's a good point. I think it's just about knowing you can do a lot of research, but knowing how much to put in. That's something that a lot of writers struggle with. So yeah, that's a good point. Do you have any tips for how to tell how much to put in?
Well, I'm definitely not the right person for writing advice. I'm the cop who helps writers. I'm not the one who tries to pretend that's outside of my expertise.
Right.
I know Stephen King says, I think it's Stephen King who says, kill your darlings, right?
Yes.
So
yeah.
I will defer to his advice.
Yeah, maybe too much research can qualify as some of your darlings. So circling back to something you said before, you said that one of the things you can do on your podcast is tell them if a scenario is unrealistic. How often do you have to say that? How often do you get unrealistic scenarios?
They tend to happen more in like a paranormal kind of story. And then it's like, well, knowing that that's your genre, we can totally get away with it. Or a fantasy or a sci-fi or, space opera kind of thing where there's a criminal justice element to it. As long as your reader is expecting it to kind of deviate from the gritty realism that a lot of the crime writing happens in, I think you'll be fine. There are a few things where I can't think of specific examples, but it will be story ideas that really came from just having an understanding of how the system works from watching too many mediocre cop shows, right?
Yeah.
And, it's like, I think this is what would happen. And so you have a lot of tropey stuff, like the angry police captain who wants the arrest now, even if it's not the right guy. And, all the stuff we've seen over and over again. It's just, not only is it regurgitating, it's also not realistic. But it's when you have, mainly it's when you have characters doing something that it's like the maverick detective who breaks all the rules. It's like, no, we're not allowed to do that. If we're breaking the rules, we're violating someone's rights. If we're violating someone's rights, we are breaking the law. And so to be a great detective means you have to understand the system and the procedures and stuff to be able to do it flawlessly and quickly. So like getting a search warrant, we don't just boot a door because we think the bad guy and his evidence are in there unless we can legally explain why. If it's inconvenient for my character to get a search warrant, that's not an excuse. Being a great detective means I can get one in 15 minutes, whether that's, through various means. And it's not just, I made a phone call and called in a favor. It's I have the skill set to write one or tell one, like explain the circumstances to a judge and get a telephonic warrant. So it's the skill sets that get me to the point, and I'm using me as an avatar for your character here. But to be great at their job means playing within the rules and being the most efficient. No different than any other sport, right? You're not breaking the rules in cheating. You're playing the game so well that you can't, that you're better than everyone else on the field. So I think that's one of the key things. So you can't have your cops going out there breaking the law and justifying it to catch the bad guy, where in reality, if you do that, your entire case is going down the toilet and that person's going to get set free.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point too, because you can actually use that as a point of character development or even a point of conflict rather than avoiding it, which would be unrealistic anyway.
Yeah. Realistically, if you did that stuff and you include it, you're like, I'm going to do this anyway and see what happens with my characters. Your character won't be a detective much longer. So even if they don't get prosecuted, they'll be back to pushing a black and white on patrol. And they're like, this is not how we investigate crime. So you can go be a dare officer or something. I mean, dare officers are great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that, but that's not an important role. But it's, you're either have the skill sets to be a detective or you don't. Right.
Interesting. So how many, I don't know if you know numbers, but how many different writers have you had writing into you about this stuff? Like, can you get a gauge on how many people are writing crime fiction right now,
Oh man, a lot. So I started with the blog in 2015. I'm hitting 4 years now on the podcast this month.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely hundreds. I have I've got a bookshelf behind me that has a bunch of books that I've helped on, and I've helped on a bunch of TV shows, and so when you're working with a TV show, you're dealing with a writer's room, so it's, you know, you're dealing with 5 writers, not just one.
Right.
So yeah, I will be conservative and say dozens, but I know it's well over 100, if not 2 or 3.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. Well, and I mean, it's known for being such a high selling genre. It's like romance is kind of the top, and then usually crime and mystery is right below that. So why do you think that this is something that's so high selling that so many people like to read about?
Well, again, stealing from smarter minds than me when it comes to storytelling, you know, conflict drives story, and criminal justice is inherently a conflict, right? You have a prosecution and you have a defense, you have a victim and a suspect, and then you have the cops who are there to you know, bring these guys to justice, the prosecutors that are there to to bring them to justice in the courtroom and make sure that they actually go to jail, go to prison. But really, I think it's we are reinforcing the concept that good triumphs over evil. And it's something that we really, really want to believe in. And the more we watch the news, the more we question whether that's really the case, especially here in California, where nobody stays in jail. And but I do think, I mean, if anything, this is kind of my inner why as to why I like helping writers, is because storytelling really is the reason I got into law enforcement. I did not have cops in my family or anything, but since I was little, I mean, it was too many episodes of Chips and Miami Vice, as I mean, I'm dating myself here, but you know, watching too many TV shows, but then also reading books. Like I remember reading Silence of the Lambs. I think it came out in like 88, 89. And so I was in like just that summer between junior high and high school or something like that. And it was the first time I read a thriller, like an adult thriller. My dad gave it to me in like one sitting. I mean, I read it. Wow. I stayed up through the night. Next thing you know, it's 5 o'clock in the morning and I'm finishing this book and I'm falling asleep. And I'm just like, man, I want to catch serial killers, you know?
Yeah.
So not only does it reinforce the, you know, good triumph over evil, but it also inspires that next generation to consider going into making this their career of not writing, but going into law enforcement and actually dedicating their lives to making a difference. And we need the right kind of people going into law enforcement. We don't need people that, you know, just want to do it because they want the power and the badge and the gun and stuff. It's like, we want the people who actually want to make a difference in the world and put the people that really need to go away and have that dedication. And I think the only way for us to inspire the next generation, especially with law enforcement being under attack in this country, is really to inspire them through story. Yeah,
I love that. I think that's great. Yeah, and I think just to add something to it, I think honestly that there's sort of a framework because of the law enforcement aspect of it, you know, just within the laws, within courtroom TV and things like that. And we know that our brains search for patterns and it makes us feel safe. So even though we can get really twisty serial killer stories, you know, at the same time, knowing there's cops investigating it, knowing there's laws they have to go by, and kind of knowing that probably by the end of the story, we'll get some sense of justice. I think that actually draws in a lot of people. I mean, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, look at Law and Order. Every single episode. I mean, they have different storylines, but every episode is very formulaic, right? You know who's going to be doing what at what point. You know, you can almost time it. But no, you're absolutely right. That pattern. And then when you disrupt that pattern, it shakes you awake. And so you still do have the ability to kind of shake things up every once in a while. But you're absolutely right. And that whole process of, especially a whodunit, right? We have the unknown. We have to go through that whole process of piecing clues together. Ultimately, we find who it is. You know, we have the all is lost moment where it's like, we have no clues left. This is going to be a cold case. How are we going to find our bad guy? And then luck breaks our way or something happens. And then now the chase is on. You know, it really does follow the traditional 3-act story structure or 4-act story structure. So it kind of writes itself to a certain extent. So yeah, definitely.
For sure. Okay, so I got to ask you this. Have you ever actually done a serial killer case that you worked on?
I have not. I've worked high profile cases, but never a serial killer. Fortunately for us, there are far more serial killers in fiction than there are in real life. So
Yeah, I've heard that too.
I have not. I'm very happy that I haven't had to.
So is there a case that really stands out to you that you worked that was either really hard or really rewarding or anything like that?
Because I still work in law enforcement, I don't really give away clues as to where I work. I just keep it kind of general. So one day I may reveal that. There is one case in particular that I was involved in pretty significantly, that I have used to kind of so I teach a course where, you basically partner with me as a homicide detective and we work this homicide case together. And it's loosely based upon a real case that I worked that was pretty interesting. So I'm not going to say anything more than that because I don't want to give anything away. But yeah, no, I've definitely had significant cases, and the rewarding ones are the ones where we sought justice, we got justice, and I was sitting in the courtroom with the family when the sentence came down for the person who took their loved one away, and those are moments that you'll never forget.
Right. So what would you say is the percentage of cases where that was the result? The result was good, as opposed to ones that either you didn't solve or you just, for whatever reason, weren't able to achieve justice?
We have it really depends on where you work as far as what your solvability rate is like. There are few cases that you will necessarily see all the way to the point where you're sitting there at sentencing watching it happen. The vast majority of cases are ones that are there's a plea bargain. So it may be something where here in California we still have the death penalty on the books, so our prosecutor may allege death, have the death penalty on the table, and they'll say, hey, if you plead to first degree murder with life without parole, we'll spare you your life, we'll take death penalty off the table, especially when we have overwhelming evidence to be able to, there's no way this guy's going to get off. So a lot of times it's kind of with the end is kind of without fanfare, right? It's a deal was made, he's going away, and that's it. And the other thing though is, even when we have this triumphant win in court, it's tempered by the fact that this all came about because somebody lost a loved one. And so it's not like high fives, we're going drinking, we did a great job. It's just like, we're closing a book on a very, very sad, or closing the book on a very sad story. So yeah, there's so those are kind of few and far between as far as it going all the way to jury trial and sentencing and that kind of thing. But we do have, where I work, at least we have a really high solvability percentage. And a lot of that has to do with being able to throw a lot of detectives at a case in the first 48 hours. And if you're working in a big city where you just are completely, if you're working in like one of the major cities that has like 300 homicides a year, that's almost one a day. There's no way that you can put 20 detectives on a case for 48 hours or 72 or a week or something like that. And so when you don't have that kind of resource like you do in, say, the suburbs where, of a decent sized department, then your solvability rate is going to go down because it's just one or two detectives working in this case, and day after tomorrow, they're going to get another one. So really where you work kind of dictates more so than, you have to have tenacity and be serious about your job. But, having resources really, really helps when it comes to, you basically have this gigantic to-do list. And when you accomplish something, it normally leads to more things on your to-do list, right? We interviewed this person and now we have this whole new avenue to investigate. But when you have, 15 partners where, each one can get, a lot of times they're paired up, but it's teams, 7 teams of detectives that can go out and do all of these things, get these things done all at the same time. It's a huge difference than just having 100 things to do. And it's me and my partner.
Yeah. That's really interesting because I don't think very many people think about that. We, like you said, we know about partners, but I don't know that I've read very many books where they have teams of detectives all working at the same time. So that's fairly common for smaller departments and things.
Yeah, because it may be, especially in the smaller communities where, or not necessarily physically smaller, like by population, but ones where it's a lower crime rate. And this is one of 2 or 3 homicides they may get in an entire year. It's like, okay, I can put down my eBay fraud case where the guy didn't send his laptop, right? It's like I can go drop that and work on this homicide case for the next week, and that will significantly improve the odds that you're going to solve that case.
Interesting. I really like that. All right, my next question is a little bit silly, but I'm interested in the course you teach, and you were saying that people who take it, they kind of partner with you to solve a crime. Because I've always been into crime, I've done certain games and certain apps that are like CSI games where you go in and they try to get you to solve the crime. And to me, they're always so juvenile. Like they just don't present enough of a challenge for me, because I think I'm too in the know about it in order for those to really work for me. So, I mean, how does your course stack up against that? Do people find it really challenging, or?
They find it more fascinating and interesting and fun. Not so ironically, I was actually interviewed for, I've been a lifelong gamer myself. I definitely have the background of playing role-playing games when I was a kid, and of course video games as well. And so I was actually interviewed about detective games for one of the online game magazines a couple of years ago. And a lot of the detective style games are really about deductive reasoning and logic and stuff like that, where it's more puzzle based versus the reality of how we work cases. And so in the course, I mean, I literally do have a set of dice on my, when the people in the class come up with ideas, it's like we'll do probability rolls and that kind of stuff. So to a certain extent, it is like a role-playing game. But it really is about brainstorming our present with a set of facts, like a body is found, and then it's, what do we need to accomplish? Where are we going to go? And so kind of brainstorming our to-do list and then prioritizing it, maybe with a little bit of dice rolling to figure out the probability of it happening right away or not. But, we just kind of go through the entire decision-making process at each step, and really putting the student in that role of, whether you're doing it as the world creator or you're doing it kind of as your character, of what would my character do at this point? What seems to make the most sense given the information I have at hand, and what do I need to do in which order? Do I go attend an autopsy, or do I go interview this key witness, or, which is the most important thing for us to do right now? So that's kind of how this whole investigation plays out, of figuring out the priorities and and also learning what we do at each step. So it's not like, okay, now that we're at this stage, these are the things we're going to do. I don't come up with that. I let the students kind of, what else can we do? What else can we do? And there might be some prompting. I spent 12 years teaching as an adjunct college faculty member. So I definitely have my teacher hat on more than my detective hat when I do these. But it's really about, getting the chance to be in that critical thinking mode as the detective, and kind of trying to come up with everything I can to figuring out how to solve this case, especially if you're lacking in evidence or witnesses or anything like that.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like it would be really valuable. I mean, because I teach writing, I kind of tend to, push everything toward that, but I almost feel like that would be valuable just in terms of even creating your story, creating your scenes, putting yourself into the character's shoes and saying, what's the most logical thing that would happen next, or probable thing, or, whatever. So I bet that even helps them in their writing, even if they don't know it,
Yeah, I've had students say, like, is there any way we can do it again, or can we do a different investigation? So it's definitely I've had only positive feedback, so that's been it's been fun, and I do look forward to, I mean, I really enjoy teaching this course, because everyone who shows up is active and interested, and they're wanting to have fun, rather than my typical college student who's taking it because it's a general ed course and they really don't care.
Right.
So we have a lot of fun in that course. So yeah.
Good. And do you teach it like over Zoom?
Yes. Yeah. So it's 6 weeks, 6 weeks of Zoom calls. So usually they're 1 hour sessions, where you get an update on the case based upon what the class kind of decides upon. I call it a cohort. So it's the same group of people every time. And so what you guys have decided, we find out what came to fruition as a result of that from the previous week. And then with that update, we then go back to, okay, what are we going to do next? Where's this going to go? So that's over Zoom. And then separate from that, every week, we also have a 1 hour office hours call. So it's, you're still a writer, you're still doing your stories, and you still have questions. And so it's a chance for us to do in-depth Q&A, more so than the podcast. It's, we'll get on Google together and find the actual answers and stuff that you need answers to, working on and stuff. And then once the 6 weeks ends, you then have access to alumni office hours. So at least once a month, all of the former students are able to come back to an office hours call. I try to make it more than once a month, but at the very least it's once a month, where and it's more than an hour, but you can get back on there and ask questions. So even if it's a year or two later and you're on your 3rd or 5th or 7th book and it's like, I have this question I need an answer to, that there's always a call coming up that you can jump on and get that question answered. But it's also a bit of a getting the band back together, where all the students are like, hey, good to see you. I mean, there's been some real friendships and networking that have developed out of it. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like it's lots of fun. So we're kind of getting to where we're going to wrap up here. Is there anything else you want, the listeners to know, or any advice you have to dispense to anybody, crime writers, regular writers, other genres, anything?
Don't be intimidated. You can absolutely write criminal, like crime fiction or criminal police procedure. You don't have to be Michael Connolly working the crime beat at LA Times or Joseph Wumbaugh working for the police department. So just get writing, and if you have questions, you can send them to me at the podcast. writersdetective.com/podcast is where you can submit a question, and I'm, in exchange for the question, I'm happy to list your author website as well to try to direct listeners there. And then, you can also learn about courses that I teach and that kind of stuff also at Writers Detective. Great.
And yes, I will say I have submitted a few questions, so it's always fun to get them answered on the podcast. It's always very enlightening. So thank you so much for being here and for all you do. You really serve authors very, very well.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. It's been fun.
Yeah, sure thing. And good luck with everything.
Likewise.